may have been confined to a small cohort of urban gay men in the West, that what was going on in Africa was a hint of things to come, in which, in fact, AIDS would put everyone at risk, and it would, in fact, become a heterosexually spread disease.
We had the honor of meeting many African doctors who seriously were worried that the whole of the AIDS science was wrong, and they were not afraid to speak out. But it was very dangerous for them to do so, and they were certainly not going to receive any funding, because in Uganda, for example, there was $6 million arriving that year for sex counseling and condom distribution, and for malaria control there were $65,000. So that's for a whole year.
Once the notion got started that stopping AIDS in Africa, which was assumed to be a heterosexually transmitted set of diseases, it could be prevented or stopped by safe sex, then I think early on in the going, there was a considerable interest on the part of missionary and church-related aid groups who argued very strongly that monogamy and abstinence and safe sex were ways, in fact, to prevent this particular kind of disease. To that extent, the WHO and the UN has found it very expedient and very practical, along political and ideological lines, to argue that the causes of these diseases in Africa and the cure for those diseases lies in the hands of the people themselves, rather than looking at the harder nut, the tougher nut to crack, which would be the historical and the institutional forces that make it such in Africa that many people do not have an adequate diet, few people have adequate sanitation throughout their lives, and the vast majority of people in Africa are subject to a wide range of diseases, all of which predated that of AIDS. So I think that's been a major motivating factor. You have to also understand that there's a reason on the African side to buy into this particular equation. With the end of the Cold War, Africa has found itself unable to play the superpower game, playing the United States or the Western powers off of the Soviet bloc. And so many ministries of health and many governments in general accepted that little dogma or not get the kind of aid and the kind of assistance that the U.S. government, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and so forth felt very strongly that this is what these African governments needed.
In early 2000, South African President Mbeki decided to host an AIDS conference that would give time not only to recognized orthodox spokespersons on AIDS, but to dissenters such as Dr. Peter Duesberg. The mass media fired off numerous attacks, excoriating the irresponsibility of them allowing a forum in South Africa for the people who challenge HIV equals AIDS equals death. Members of the AIDS establishment even went to the length of earnestly calling for the criminal prosecution of AIDS dissidents.
When HIV positive people, children as well as adults, were given effective treatment for the conditions that they actually presented with, which were things like TB, gastrointestinal infections, when they were treated for these conditions, they actually had a better life expectancy than non-HIV positive people within the cohort studied. It was because in the circumstances of these studies, they had undertaken to give medical support to people who tested positive. It was a condition on which the people allowed themselves to be tested. So given that medical support, these people had better health records than those who had not tested HIV positive.
I think this drumbeat of hysteria, of panic, of alarmism, and of fear is doing immense psychological, social, and medical damage to many people in Africa. People who otherwise would have gone to a clinic to get treated for something like diarrhea or a persistent cough or a fever are terrified of going to a clinic because instead of being treated for those kinds of symptoms, they're afraid that they're going to get an AIDS diagnosis, which they understand to be a death sentence. When people do get just such a diagnosis based on those clinical symptoms, and they return to their villages, they return to the villages to die. They basically give up all hope. They lose the will to live. They become an outcast. They are, in a culture like many African cultures in southern Africa, where the extended family is everything, to be rejected by your extended family, to be forced to live in a secluded, segregated little hut away from the rest of the family, to have only meager amounts of food, meager amounts of water given to you, is to prepare the person for death. And what do you think happens? The person dies. And when the person dies, they will say, weepingly, with atrocious photographs in the newspaper, he or she was another victim of the AIDS epidemic, which is everywhere in Africa.
If someone came along and told them there is no AIDS, all there is the same diseases that Africans have been dying of all along, then all of a sudden millions of dollars of funding would dry up. And Africans are colluding with this as well. Not very many of them, but there are a few Africans in positions where they're able to collect a lot of this money. You know, heads of clinics or directors of public health services and people like that. There's an awful lot of money that can come their way as long as everybody thinks that Africa is besieged with a giant AIDS epidemic.
The pharmaceutical giants like Roche and Abbott and Glaxo Wellcome and so forth have made offers to African governments, in which I think they expect to be subsidized for this. They've made offers to African governments over the last couple of years, particularly to South Africa, to offer these so-called antiretrovirals, which are a controversy in and of themselves, like AZT and the other nucleoside analog drugs, but to make those drugs available at what the pharmaceuticals would consider a cut rate price. What they mean by cut rate would be that an individual's dose would cost about $200 a month. Well, the vast majority of people in Africa don't have a per capita income of $200 a year. So someone is going to have to subsidize these kinds of drugs, making them available in Africa, and I think that the pharmaceuticals will look towards state organizations or multilateral institutions.
Here it is, all these years later, and it baffles me that not only is AZT still being used, but they're trying to expand its usage into the third world and into Africa, into poor countries, into poor communities in the United States, in spite of widespread evidence of its toxicity, widespread evidence that AZT, in fact, causes what we call AIDS.
They're taking the show to the third world, and they're not only giving AZT to what will probably be millions of women in the third world, whether they're HIV positive or not, but they're also insisting that they stop breastfeeding and start formula feeding, supposedly in an effort to prevent transmission of HIV, which of course has never been isolated from breast milk. Only antibodies, and even that only 25% or something, pretty much like the semen data. But they are they're launching here what is bound to be a real disaster, a real serious loss of human life.
Mother's milk, which pediatricians around the world will tell you is the healthiest food that a newborn can have because of the immunological properties in mother's milk, that women should in fact cease breastfeeding their young. Now this to me seems something more than just a crime. This is absolutely diabolical and evil, and I am at least encouraged that there's been some dissension and some skepticism for a change within the bowels of the WHO. An organization that's argued very strongly for breastfeeding is now coming to grips with maybe one of the big contradictions in the whole HIV/AIDS a construct.
I can't imagine that it'll work out any other way than that you're going to just see tens, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe even more babies dying. And they'll probably say they died of AIDS no matter what happens. So nobody will even be held accountable this time. Oh, here's the one thing they're doing. So they can demonstrate that this has nothing to do with any particular formula company making money off of this situation. The WHO or UNAIDS or whoever it is insisting that the formula gets shipped in bottles without labels.